there's probably not a single story as overtold in Canada as that of the Mad Trapper. My grandfather listened to the radio reports as they were coming in when he was growing up in the North Shore, following the massive manhunt in Canada's Arctic as it was playing out. He was so taken by this world-famous tale of the Mounties hunting this mysterious Mad Trapper that he would frequently tell me the story when I was a kid. I wanted to do an episode on the Mad Trapper, but like I said, pretty much everyone's told the story. I was kind of hoping that maybe I could find a new angle on it, some kind of Maritimes connection maybe. Well, maybe that'll be a future episode. But while I was looking into this, I stumbled across a different interesting story about a trapper-related manhunt in the Maritimes that was told by a name you'll probably remember, because he's appeared on 2 podcasts so far. Detective William Carr. As the Mad Trapper manhunt was dominating headlines even in faraway England in 1932, Detective William Carr was doing a press tour of that country trying to sell his brand new book called High and Dry, which he'd written about his experiences trying, and quite frankly, failing quite miserably actually, to take down the famous rum runner Joe Walnut and his Madawaska mob. Much to the detective's annoyance, though, on his book tour, he found that all the English reporters weren't interested in his book at all. The only thing they wanted to ask him about was his thoughts on the ongoing Mad Trapper drama that was still happening in Canada. So, Detective William Carr told the reporters about his own earlier encounter with some very different renegade trappers that he'd encountered deep in the icy woods of Carleton County in New Brunswick some years earlier.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
Detective Carr had first met the trapper he simply called Lee while borrowing his horse while working on an earlier case pursuing some rum runners. It was the winter of 1920, and the detective was not actually supposed to be working when he got drawn into this trapper hunt. All he had wanted to do was to learn how to go ice fishing. He was on good terms with Lee after borrowing his horse to get into that rum runner chase, and he knew that Lee was going to be headed off deep into the woods of Carleton County to check his trap lines, and he basically just invited himself along in order to get the trapper to teach him how to go ice fishing. Detective William Carr said that
Lee was a typical backwoods man, tall and slim he was, and lithe like a panther. He didn't walk like we walk, he simply glided along. When the wind was still and the air literally dead, in the silence of those mighty woods, that of a tomb, he could float along the trails without making the slightest sound.
the two of them set off well before daylight broke.
2 hours passed without a word. I was too tired to talk and was satisfied to keep plodding along, trying to keep up to the tireless pace he set.
They found that all of Lee's traps were empty. As he reached for yet another empty snare, Lee swore and he demanded the car, "Look here!"
I looked, but saw nothing to justify the oath.
You city fellows are plumb dumb. I mean blind. They could rob the eyes right out of your head and you'd never know it. See these hairs stuck to the jaws of the trap? These black hairs are off a fisher cat. Some thief has robbed my trap line.
They were baffled at having such an issue, considering they were so far away out in the backwoods. They were miles and miles away from the nearest house. But there wasn't really much they could do about it. A recent heavy snow had covered up any signs that humans may have actually been there recently. And so they moved on. Detective Carr got the ice fishing demonstration that he was promised. At a lake, Lee showed the detective how to cut a hole in the ice, and then he baited a hook with bacon. Almost instantly, Lee pulled out a sizable trout.
To say it astounded me is to state it mildly.
Detective Carr inquired if the lake was teeming with fish.
Don't kid yourself. I've heard dozens say there are no fish in the lake. Fish have their habits like everything else.
Lee explained his trick to the detective. He cut a hole in the ice near the spring that fed the lake. The trout had been hanging around the spring because the spring water was cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Relatively speaking, of course.
There's really no need to freeze or starve in the woods.
The trapper told the detective.
It's the greenhorns that get into trouble.
After frying their catch at a lakeside campfire, the two of them resumed checking the trapper's lines. It turned out that all of Lee's traps were empty. Lee was convinced that it was the work of thieves, declaring,
They must have followed my trail when I've been going my rounds and located my traps. They waited for a snowstorm, then robbed my traps knowing the falling snow would cover their tracks. These fellows aren't so far away. They are probably strangers. If so, they've probably built a cabin or are using one of the old logging camps. I'm going to circle around today and see if I can pick up their trail.
Detective William Carr worked in St. John, which at the time was the province's only big city. His day job was apprehending rum runners, and this was the very early days of Prohibition. This wasn't the era of gunfights or the Liberty making dangerous escapes, as we saw in the Liberty on the Rocks trilogy. Basically, in these early days, his job was simply tracking down bars that were operating selling illegal booze and handing them fines. This wasn't a high stakes or difficult job. The bar owners would pay their fines and go back to selling more booze the next day. There was certainly no risk or threat of violence in the big city at this time. Perhaps thinking that things in the backwoods of Carleton County worked just the same as in the big city, the detective instantly suggested to Lee that they should try and arrest the thieves. He developed a whole plan. He and Lee would head off as usual, but then they would double back over their own footprints to capture the trap robbers in action, and then they would arrest them. It wasn't a terrible plan, actually. The tactic of doubling over their own footsteps in the snow had been used successfully by the mad trapper to elude the Mounties high in the Arctic. However, Lee instantly threw cold water on the straight-laced English detective's plan. The trapper declared to the detective that he wasn't in the big city anymore. The backwoods of Carleton County were no place to be confronting strangers who would almost certainly be armed. Life was dangerous out there in Carleton County, and their lives would be short if they tried anything as foolish as trying to arrest two armed strangers when they were approximately a 16-hour walk away from the nearest human settlement. Instead, Lee suggested a considerably more cautious plan, which they did end up following. Instead of backtracking, they snowshoed through the snow in a big looping circle, and they slowly crossed back over their own tracks hours later. Sure enough, when they crossed their own tracks hours later, the footprints in the snow that they saw showed their own footprints that from the way they'd passed a couple hours earlier, and two other sets of footprints. They were being followed by two men. The trapper and the detective were themselves now being hunted through the snowy backwoods by two strangers who were robbing Lee's traps. In a kind of reversal, Lee and Detective Carr began tracing back the two robbers' tracks. Not to follow them, though, mind you. They definitely didn't want a confrontation in the deep woods, miles from civilization. Instead, they followed the strangers' tracks back to where they came from, and they discovered the trap thieves had been hiding out in an old logging camp. They opened the door and went inside. There, Detective Carr found
Nice catch of fur hung up on the walls and tied up in bundles ready for packing out.
Lee, meanwhile, just flatly announced to the detective that
I'm taking the fur they've got bundled.
Detective Carr, who was very by the books, protested as Lee began picking through and taking some of the furs. but the trapper didn't stop and simply told him.
It's probably mine anyway.
The trapper then informed the detective what their next plan of action was.
Chances are they'll know they've been caught and won't follow us. But if they do, it means trouble. I'm headed straight for home. It'll be 16 hours steady going. I can travel these woods by night. They won't be able to catch us by night. Do you think you can do it?
In Detective Carr's retelling, he responded to the trapper that he could in fact manage the 16-hour straight snowshoe hike back to the nearest humans, although he did note that his voice sounded a lot more confident than he actually felt. They went through the woods on snowshoes. They crossed over 2 beaver dams to get over swamps. They removed their snowshoes at one point in order to cross a windswept frozen lake in order to confuse their pursuers by having their tracks disappear. And they trekked all night straight through the snowy forest without any rest. It turns out that Lee had actually been pretty optimistic when he suggested it was going to be a 16-hour hike. Or possibly Detective Carr was slowing him down, because it actually took 25 hours of straight travel before they managed to reach Lee's home and notify authorities about the rogue trappers. Detective Carr wrote,
We had eaten nothing except some biscuits. My reward was a hearty breakfast of buckwheat pancakes and boiled eggs, and after that, a sound sleep. Lee's reward was $600 worth of prime fur.
That $600 reward would be, in today's money, about $8,500. A posse of police and game wardens were dispatched to the old logging camp where the thieves were arrested without incident. Perhaps aware that the British public he was telling his story to probably were wondering why he and Lee didn't confront the 2 trap thieves directly, Detective Carr explained to his English readers that Canadian winter manhunts either ended in surrenders or shootouts.
Officers of the law in the backwoods country know that it is comparatively easy to get their man once they're on the right trail. They also know this: if the man they are after shows he is aware they are on his trail and does not stop and surrender, the police realize at once he intends to die fighting.
The police could ultimately not prove that the 2 trap thieves had actually stolen the furs from Lee's traps. They were indeed actually charged, but they weren't charged with theft. Instead, they were charged with poaching. You see, when Lee was picking through the piles of furs in the old logging camp, he'd been careful to leave any beaver pelts behind. It was closed season on beaver trapping that winter, meaning that it was illegal to hunt them, and that's why the 2 trap thieves were charged as poachers.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.